have Ashley Moerke. She is a director and professor at Lake Superior State University. She's been conducting research on fisheries and aquatic ecology in the Great Lakes Basin for over 15 years. She's earned her bachelor's from the University of Minnesota Duluth and a master's and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. She joined the faculty at Lake Superior State University in 2004 and is currently a full professor as well as the director of the Center for Freshwater Research and Education. She's taught over 15 different courses in the Fisheries and Wildlife Management Program at LSSU and was recently awarded the has been awarded the LSSU and the Michigan Distinguished Professor of the Year awards. She works a lot with undergraduates and in particular focuses on the ecology and conservation of freshwater fisheries and aquatic ecosystems, including the ecology of migratory fisheries, effects of invasive species, and landscape stressors on aquatic ecosystems, stream restoration, and stream and wetland bioassessment. She was appointed to by the Michigan governor to serve as the advisor to Lake Superior State Community of Great Lakes Fisheries Commission and on the governor's Environmental Science Advisory Board. And today she's going to be talking about the threats to Lake Superior fisheries, on thin ice, understanding climate change threats to Lake Superior fishes. And she, I think between she and Van win the award for coming the farthest after flying over the Great Lakes to get here. So we're so happy to have you.
Thank you. Is it okay if I don't use the microphone? What I lack in height, I've been told I've been blessed with volume. So can everybody in the back hear me if I speak? Great, thanks. It's also like something about being height challenged behind a podium. I feel like I need a little bit of a booster, so it makes me feel a bit more comfortable. So I want to say thanks to Susan for inviting me and for everybody as well. It is, I feel like, a success already. Just getting out of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in February is a real challenge, and then probably getting to Lake Placid. So the fact that I made it last night, I'm just really excited about. Whether or not I leave, we'll see. That will be debatable. I'm excited to talk about some issues that we've been thinking about in Lake Superior and climate change. And I think I have a relatively unique perspective recently because about 2 weeks ago I returned from Australia. And it was a vacation for 16 days. And out of those 16 days, I think I saw the sun twice. And we had hazardous air quality for 14 of those 16 days. And so it was really an eye-opener and a reminder about how climate change is really a visible global issue now, and that it's becoming much more communicated to the public and hopefully to our politicians as well. Oh, got it. Okay. And so I just wanted to, before I get into some of that, I wanted to just acknowledge that anything I talk about, I mean, I'm at a very small undergraduate institution, so all of my work is collaborative and is work representing, excellent work done by a lot of my collaborators and colleagues. I also wanted to acknowledge one of my dearest colleagues at Lake State, which is Kevin Kapusinski, who was a former New York AFS member, and we stole him from you. And Kevin's words of advice were, don't embarrass him. And so I almost took that as a challenge, like what could I do to embarrass him? But I promised I wouldn't do that in the plenary, but all bets are off for the social, so we'll see. And then I work with a lot of really amazing undergraduate students that I'm constantly amazed and proud of, and so much of the work I'll talk about, you'll see their role in that as well. So now thinking about this global issue of climate change, I'm going to go back to where I was 2 weeks ago in Australia, and you probably saw these pictures, these images all over the news, and probably the ones of koalas with their little mittens on from their burned paws. And this was really reflective of not just something that happened overnight, but scientists were kind of calling an alarm signal for many years now, showing that there were decades of increasing temperatures, and that this ultimately manifested itself in something very visible, and it was these extreme fires in areas that hadn't burned before, like in temperate rainforests. So this wasn't the typical dry grassland fires that they were seeing. This was in environments that weren't typically wildfire areas. In addition, last year there was another major warning flag for Australia. They saw, this graph at the top shows you these orange bars are representing what they call cease to flow periods. And being from the Great Lakes, I just never thought in that mindset about how you're measuring cease to flow. And so these were all the periods in the Murray-Darling River Basin, the largest river in Australia, that ceased to flow at certain points in the river. And you can see that they get more extensive and more frequent, so longer duration as we get into more recent decades. And that resulted in last year in one of the biggest fish kills in the Murray-Darling's history, where they lost over 1 million fish, including their iconic Murray cod. And so this is really kind of bringing I think, climate change to more of a global visible recognition. And when I was there, I thought a lot about how lucky we are in the Great Lakes to have all this water and that we weren't really as impacted as much. And you know, coming from Lake Superior, where I've done much of my work in that basin, this is the lake that has really been able to resist a lot of the impacts, just like Brian was talking about in the last talk, the impacts of dreissenids and round gobies. That's not impacting Lake Superior. It's so large, it's remote, it's too deep, it's cold, it's poor nutrients, and so it's really resisted a lot of those major impacts. But then when I step back, I thought, well, I think when we start thinking about what's going on, there are some kind of early indicators of climate change. So in the last couple of years, you might have seen in the news that Lake Superior has had a couple incidences of unprecedented blue-green algal blooms in Lake Superior. Now I know if I said that for Lake Erie, people wouldn't even blink, that's almost expected. But in Lake Superior, this is a really unusual phenomenon. So the first one was down in Ashland, Wisconsin, in Paso Islands. The second one up in Thunder Bay. Both of these producing blue-green algae, something that we haven't seen before. So maybe this is kind of a sign, an early sign, our kind of burning fire equivalent to Australia. And this is what climate change projections are saying, is that if you look at the Great Lakes region, air temperature is going to, of course, increase. In Lake Superior, we're going to see more of that. And in fact, scientists are demonstrating that as well. Jay Austin out of Duluth is showing that we have seen in recent decades a rapid increase in water temperature. And in fact, a recent NASA study that was released said that Lake Superior is one of the fastest warming lakes in all of the world. In fact, it's warming at 3 times the global average. So we're really going to see this impact of climate change, or suspected, could be magnified. And that kind of water temperature climate feedback is ultimately resulting in a decline in ice cover over the long-term trends as well. So if you think about, it's not just about temperature, that there's a lot else going on that's going to affect what's going on in this entire really giant basin. And so most of the projections say an increase in precipitation, and that most of that precipitation is going to come in more intensive, extreme events. We're also seeing a shift from snow in more of the rain events during the winter and into the spring, and that's going to manifest itself in things like changes in ice cover, changes in hydrology of tributaries coming into Lake Superior, and then ultimately some changes in nearshore habitat environments. Some of that might be from more extreme storm events, or it might be from just more rapid warming in some of these areas. So what I'm going to do is tell 3 tales of potential change. And I call them tales because they're short stories. They aren't fiction, but they're just getting you to think about what might be some early warning signs, or what are some areas that we need to think about might be most susceptible to climate change in the Great Lakes. I'm going to talk about first a pelagic native fish, so thinking about an example of what's going on in the big lake itself. Then I'm going to talk about some migratory fish dynamics, so thinking about what's going on in the basin and how that's connected to the lake. And then I'll end talking about a recent invader that might be a sign of the times as well. So let's talk about the first tale, Cisco and Ice. I feel like that could be a good children's cartoon or something, like Cisco and his sidekick Ice. And so that maybe is my next sabbatical, I guess. And but really, it's just about the fish Cisco and ice cover dynamics and how that might be changing the success of those populations in the future. So in Lake Superior, like in Lake Ontario, Cisco is one of the major cragganines that we find. In fact, it's been the most abundant and most biomass for many years. Recently, we've seen a dramatic decline in their biomass, about 50% over the last decade. But it has historically been a really important commercial fishery. There's still some commercial fishery, primarily for its roe when they spawn in the fall. And if you're around Lake Superior, some of the local shops at that time will sell what they call Lake Superior Gold. I haven't tried it, but just by the name it does sound enticing. And so because of this long-term interest in it being one of our most important native fish in terms of biomass and abundance, but also that commercial and recreational fishery, there's been a lot of interest in its population dynamics and trying to explain what's been going on with it. We know that Cisco are a species that are kind of a boom and bust species. They have really good productive years, strong year classes, and then they might go a few years where we don't see that. And that's exactly, this data from Mark Vinson and the USGS historical trawl data show across the lake-wide means that you'll see years where there's really high numbers of age ones, and then you'll see that we have kind of periods where there's really no evidence of a strong reproduction effort. In this case, the last time we've seen any H1 year class of any strength was back in 2003. And so the question is, what is it that's changing that is ultimately resulting in low recruitment to the Cisco population in Lake Superior? Now, Mark has been working with his data. He has 38 years of data that represent kind of low recruitment or poor recruitment years up to high recruitment years. And he's been trying to develop a predictive model to better understand this. And the lake is huge, it's extremely complex. When you see their trawling marks of where they go along the lake, it's like little pins, like just pop. It's a really difficult system to work in. And so what he found though is that the first factor that he can really get a strong relationship with is that it's early ice. Seems to be driving whether or not it'll be a poor or strong recruitment year. And so that was differentiating really most of the ice cover that is in January early ice that was over 15% was suggesting that that could lead to stronger recruitment. And that made sense because this is showing a satellite image of where ice cover is at 15% in January, and then on the left, this is showing the 100-meter bathymetric zone. And so that's where most of the Cisco spawning locations have been identified in that area. So it suggests that that might be really representative of protecting that Cisco spawning habitat at that time. He still has a lot of work to go and hasn't really been able to find a strong driver beyond that early ice. But it does seem to show some support for that. So this is showing you maximum ice cover, so 100% on this end, and this is just showing you recruitment strength. And so what you see is that where we have more ice cover, it ultimately results in some of our stronger year classes. And so that goes in line with what his predictive model is saying. But now the question is, well, why? What's going on? What's the mechanism? And we need to know the mechanism in order to be able to understand how to potentially make sure we can sustain these populations. And so one of them that is often thrown around is this idea of disturbance, that the ice is just literally protecting the bottom eggs from being disturbed. So they spawn in the fall, the eggs overwinter about 30 feet depth, and then they hatch really somewhere around ice out, so maybe April-ish. And that if we have early ice off, that results in physical disturbance. There's actually really no evidence of what that physical disturbance is at that depth. And so it's something that's often used, but it's pretty deep water at that point. It would have to be some real gale storms in order to impact the bottom. And so there's still a lot of information that's kind of needed to inform that. But it's kind of an intuitive one. The other that's kind of intuitive is that increasing or warming temperatures in the spring could increase development rate. And so they've done some work in the lab that shows that's not surprising. And in the lake, they see this as well, that in warmer years, just by 1 degree warmer, they see hatching dates are about 40 days earlier. And so the thought is that if they're using up their reserves very quickly, that they no longer can sustain themselves until their resources and plankton bloom within that spring. The other area that's getting some interesting attention is Mark's been working with Jason Stockwell and a student, Tyler Stewart, where they've done some preliminary work on photoperiod. And so one of the thoughts is that it's really photoperiod driving their larval development, and that as the ice thins and we see more light transmission, that's causing them to use up their energy reserves. And so they've done a really preliminary study that actually supports that. So without light, you'll see the mean yolk sac area is much larger. And so they're actually in the process of replicating now, and so we're kind of waiting the results. But it's giving us some idea about what might be the mechanisms actually affecting them. So what's the fate of Cisco for this story then? I mean, I think the key is that we know that ice cover is playing a role, and that as we see the predictions occur that we're going to have declines in ice cover, that likely means that we're going to see declines in those Cisco populations. There is some hope. What Mark's group has found is that because we've had these polar vortex years, these harsh winters like every 4 or 5 years, that might be enough because of this boom and bust cycle to make sure that Cisco persists, that they might have a strong year class in that time. But that's really kind of hedging our bets on those polar vortex years. But what's probably more important is that we start to understand those mechanisms. Is it a habitat, a physical disturbance thing? Is it a light transmission issue? What's actually going on? And then are there places throughout the Great Lakes that are going to be more resistant to those changes in climate? So is it that perhaps this area that's a bit more protected from the northwesterlies might be habitat that we want to prioritize for refuge or change regulations in that system? So understanding those mechanisms helps us get to that point. Okay, so tail number 2. Moving from the open water and into the tributaries, I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe this idea that migratory fishes and flow might be a good example as well, or an early indicator of how climate change may influence Lake Superior. So one of the things we know is that there are a lot of tributaries flowing directly into Lake Superior, hundreds of them. Many of them being first through third order streams, very small, directly into it. And Lake Superior has one of the highest numbers of streams that are barrier free. Over 50% of those still have direct connection to the lake. And half of fishes are expected to actually use those systems at some point in their life, many of them for spawning. We know that spawning runs used into neighboring tributaries are often important because fish are seeking out optimal habitat for their eggs and larvae to rear, and that many of those cases, it's environmental cues that initiate that. This is another one of those ideas where it's indicated that environmental cues are important for fish in general. There's been some suggestions from tropical areas, from temperate areas, from marine and freshwater fish. But we really don't know a lot about the phenology of those for Great Lakes fishes, and certainly not in Lake Superior itself. But discharge is one of the environmental factors that's expected to be most important in initiating spawning and initiating that migration. And the climate projections aren't looking good in terms of discharge. So if discharge is an important environmental cue, it's really important that we understand how that changes and whether or not migratory fishes are going to be sensitive to that change. So this is just showing you a predicted hydrological response. So this is a hydrograph showing you the annual response. And what you see is that the red line is suggesting kind of the worst case scenario. And as expected, we're expecting to see earlier runoff in the spring. We're expecting to see higher magnitude or higher flashy flows in the spring, as well as the winter. I didn't write that. And then lower summer flows. And so during the summer, those periods are going to be much drier, and in many cases maybe causing intermittent flows in some small systems. So the question then is, how does this change in hydrologic regime, or how's this predicted change, how's that variability affect fishes that are keying in on those systems for spawning? Is it that it's going to affect their ability to spawn? Is it going to affect their ability for those larvae to recruit? And so we wanted to start looking at the phenology of Great Lakes fishes, particularly Lake Superior. And the first thing we did is just to try to do a big literature survey. And this is just a Scopus search of how many papers were looking at Great Lakes and stream and river migration on fish. And what you see is there's not a whole lot. You'll see and most of what's done is sea lamprey, which are the black bars, or salmonids, particularly coho and chinook salmon, some rainbow trout. And then Pete McIntyre's group has the yellow, which is basically looking at suckers. But there's really very little work in that region looking at assemblages, so how different spawners, when they're running in together, and how those interactions might impact whether or not we see higher or low recruitment in those systems. So we started a study up in eastern Lake Superior on several streams. They are all within about 10 kilometers of each other, second to third order systems, small, groundwater fed, all draining a national forest. So what you kind of consider pristine upper peninsula systems. And we set back-to-back flight nets for ice-free period. This is where undergraduates are great. They're cheap labor and they love to be outside all the time. And so we were setting them for 2 days a week, 24-hour sets for 2 days a week for those entire ice-free periods to try to get an understanding of what's using the system, what's the phenology, so then we can start teasing apart some of these other questions. I'll just give you a real simple idea of what we found, but it was surprising to us. So these are the 3 streams, and I don't show you the composition, but just to show you the bars, there were 12 migrants that we found, so 12 migratory species. But in common, of 3 streams that are within 10 kilometers of each other, they only had 2 species that were in common across all 3 streams. And those 2 species were both introduced. So it was coho salmon and it was steelhead or rainbow trout. So those were the only common migratory species we found in 3 systems that were right next to each other. That really surprised us. The systems were kind of looked like replicates to us, but they were playing a really different role for different migratory fishes in the system. Now, when you look at phenology, it brings up some other interesting questions. So this is just one site to give you an example. There's a lot going on. I'll kind of walk you through it quickly. But this is just showing you what our catch looked like over that time to see when species were coming in. And what we saw consistently across all of our sites was that long-nosed suckers and the suckers that have, or the runs that had white suckers, or the streams that had white suckers, they came in relatively kind of constricted time periods. So they were often running about 7 to 10 days. So pretty defined time periods. And then we had steelhead come in, and they were in much more protracted time periods. So we were starting to see that they were much more variable. Some years they would come in with the long-nosed suckers. Some years they'd come in a week or 2 after the long-nosed suckers. So they weren't necessarily keying in at the same queue as long-nosed suckers were. And then coho salmon were our fall spawners. And what you see is that they just kind of trickle in, and they're just kind of trickling in through over time. And they have this really protracted spawning period. So when you start looking at these phenology patterns, it starts getting us to think about, what species might be more vulnerable, and then how does that vulnerability change with interactions with introduced species. So something like a coho salmon, where it has individuals coming in spawning over a couple of months, probably isn't going to be affected by an unpredictable spate that occurs, at some point in time, because there are other individuals that will be able to offset that. But something like a long-nosed sucker, which is spawning in a really kind of constricted time period, might be more vulnerable to that. And so if you overlay that with just that change, or the predicted change in hydrology, what it says is that our spring spawners are really during this time period, and then our fall spawners during this time period. Those are the time periods where we're expecting to see the highest changes in hydrological variability. And so really trying to understand what that means, does it mean anything, is kind of the key. The other interesting factor is on Lake Superior, we have a lot of systems that are sand barrier systems. And so there are times where during the summer you get really low flows and very little wind coming in, and the mouth will actually close off, or the mouth shifts continuously and restricts it. So with increasing low flows, maybe there is potential that we could actually see some of these systems being disconnected from the lake. So if they're disconnected from the lake, what does that mean for spawners? Does that mean that the spawners are going to spawn on shoals further out? Does it mean that they'll resorb their eggs? We don't know that for many of those species. So there are all these kind of interesting, complex questions to ask. So thinking about then the fate of migratory fishes, what is the, we think that, hydrology is going to play a role. There's probably no question that it will. It's just to what extent, to what species, and how does that interact with some of these other variables. So I think there is tremendous opportunity for research in this area across all the Great Lakes, not just Lake Superior. But thinking about temporal overlap of spawners, are there certain conditions that result in these spawning assemblages all kind of overlapping when they're spawning? Is it that they're partitioning their habitat during that, or is it that they're partitioning spawning over a time period? We don't know what that dynamic is. There's also a question about the mismatch of larvae with plankton beings. So when larvae drift out of that system, and sometimes in really rapid pulses, and enter into the nearshore area of Lake Superior, is it that if we have a shift, an earlier shift in those spring runoff events, that the larvae are coming out before we see the blooms and plankton, which are their food source that will sustain them? And would that result in recurrence?